Well, hello there. We're going to be Well, hi there. We're going to be covering the female reproductive system. Chapter 23 is the reproductive system in general, but I broke it into two sections so that we can cover it in a little more detail independently, female and male. So, starting with the general overview of the female reproductive system, this figure goes over the very, very basic terms that you would need to know for an exam, first of all. But secondly, these are the very basic terms that review the elements of the female reproductive system. There are other elements that are very important, things like ligaments, connective tissue, and all of those things also have names. But for now, in this course, we're just going to stick to the very basics. So we have, starting with the most internal organ, the ovary, which is where, let's get some pencils going here, which is where gametes are made. The fimbriae are the very beginnings. They're kind of like these fingers that extend over the ovary to the fallopian tube. The fallopian tube can also be called the uterine tube. I tend to call it fallopian tube because that's the terminology I learned when I was in college. The urinary bladder is not a part of the reproductive system, but it sits kind of, I guess you would say, more inferior to the uterus. And so as a child is growing and the baby gets larger, the uterus extends and stretches out and fits over the urinary bladder. So let me see if I can get another color going here. Let me get some green going here. So as the uterus expands, the baby will be the weight of the baby will put pressure on the urinary bladder. And sometimes pregnant mothers have they feel like they need to go often because the weight of the baby is resting on the urinary bladder. We have the pubic bone, which is in the front of the pelvis. There's the clitoris, the labium majora, which is the outer, I guess you would say, like lips of the outer opening of the female reproductive system. The labium minora, which is the smaller set of lips. We have the vagina, which is the entrance into the female reproductive tract. The cervix, which is the opening into the actual uterus itself. And then this is the body cavity right here. And this would be the pelvic cavity of the female body. So I went through all of these terms. Body cavity. Okay. So let's talk about the structural plan. One of the things in biology that we do discuss often with all animals are the body plans and the organs plans. And when we say the word plan, what we mean is we're paying attention to how the shape of that organ or the shape of the system or the shape of the body, how it's laid out, allows the organ to do its job. Okay, and so a structural plan has to do with the individual organs associated with a system and whether or not they are essential or accessory. The essential organs, of course, are going to be the things that really help maintain homeostasis. Things that are accessory are things that the individual system and the individual organism can kind of live without. So let's go through the reproductive system, the female reproductive system, and try to look at what's essential and what is accessory. Okay, so I have a few things here I want to erase before we do that. I know that this came on real quick for you guys, but let's erase these little dots. One of the things I was trying to do here as I moved forward was I want to talk briefly about oogenesis and meiosis. So remember, in meiosis, you start with a stem cell that divides once, and that's M1, right? Divides once, giving rise to two new cells, and those two cells divide, which is M2 or meiosis 2, giving rise to two new cells each. So now you have 4 cells as an outcome. All right. Now in female gametogenesis, it's a little different. So the first meiotic division, you get 2 cells, but one of these cells degenerates. That cell just doesn't make it. All right. And this first cell actually came from a stem cell that divided and regenerated itself and gave rise to this primary oocyte. Okay, it divides, one of them just degenerates and the other one survives, and then this cell divides again and one of the two again degenerates. So this is M1, this is M2, and this first step just don't worry about it right now. That's the stem cell kicking off the primary oocyte, okay? So what ends up happening in female oogenesis is out of 4 possible outcomes, only one survives because at the end of M1, one of the 2 outcomes just disintegrates, and after M2, the other one just disintegrates. And how is that chosen? Nobody knows. It's just what it is. So this happens in the ovaries in females, and we'll look at a picture of that in a minute. Now, the ovaries are essential. They're called gonads, and the final outcome is called an ova. Okay, it's not an egg in women and humans. It's actually called an ova. It's an egg in fish and in chickens and birds, but in mammals, it's called an ova. Accessory organs of the reproductive tracts are going to be ducts or modified ducts, and that does include the oviduct or the fallopian tube, the uterus, and the vagina. Sex glands, including mammary or breast tissue, and some other glands that honestly I never heard about until I took human anatomy, and then external genitalia. So if we're moving forward here, what we're going to look at is I mentioned that meiosis, remember? So this is a picture or artist rendition of an ovary. So here's a anterior view of the female reproductive system focusing on the ovary. This little line right here is the ligament holding the ovary in place. And right here are the fimbriae of the fallopian tubes, all right? So each ovary has a vasculature. So there are plenty of capillaries, this very richly vascularized organ. Here's the small venule, here's the arteriole coming in. And so as I was mentioning, you have these primary follicle cells here. This is what you're looking at right here, the primary follicle, primary oocyte, okay? The primary follicle starts developing, and there are cells around the outside surrounding the ovum part, the primary ovum. So the primary follicle is just a cell. Okay, and then the primary ovum, coming back here, I said follicle, this is the primary ovum. Sorry about that. Primary ovum. The follicle portion starts expanding, and actually it generates an open cavity inside of it. The primary ovum itself divides, giving rise to a secondary ovum. The other options are taken off the table. Remember, they degenerate. And at this point, when you have the secondary ovum, and a full follicle, this is called a mature Graafian follicle, okay, the whole structure. That includes the secondary ovum, the kind of open space, it's open and it's filled with liquid, and then you have the follicle cells surrounding the ovum. What eventually happens during the luteal cycle is the ovum, or I should say the Graafian follicle, ruptures, releasing the ovum into the external environment where it can enter the fallopian tubes by passing, I shouldn't say through, but passing into the fallopian tubes through the fimbriae there. Now, the ruptured follicle itself becomes what we call the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will continue to produce hormones, which we'll talk about maybe a little bit later. The late corpus luteum just kind of starts collapsing down in on itself, and eventually it looks kind of like just like a white little fluffy piece of tissue, and we call this the tissue albicans. So basically, the ovaries themselves, so this is the meiosis that happened inside of the ovaries. The ovaries themselves are paired glands, so most women have 2. Sometimes there are a few genetic disorders where a woman may only have 1 ovary. Each one weighs about 3 grams, so they're pretty small. They do look, I wouldn't say they resemble large almonds. They look a little more round to me, but okay. They are attached by ligaments to the pelvic cavity, and that's what I showed right here in green. These are ligaments holding the ovaries in between the pelvic cavity and the uterus, and their microscopic structure contains the ovarian follicles with the oocyte, which is the immature ovum, and then the primary follicles. And so by the time we are adult women, we have about 350 to 500 mature follicles in each ovary. Now, not all of those follicles are going to develop, and those are the Graafian follicles. So most women over their entire lifetime, if you think about the luteal cycle happening 12 times a year, well, If it happens 12 times a year, and let's say that happens for 10 years, that's 120 times, right? So it's easy to think that a woman can have 350 to 500 mature Graafian follicles bursting to give rise to a mature ovary that has the potential of being fertilized. Now, these secondary follicles, okay, this hollow chamber in here is called an antrum. All right, the antrum is full of fluid, and the fluid helps allow the liberated ovum to circulate into the uh, reproductive tract. Trying to change, there we go. So what is the function of our ovaries? Of course, oogenesis, where meiosis occurs. Ova are actually quite large, okay? The polar bodies are what are left of those two meiotic divisions. So remember, we had this one taken off the table. This becomes a polar body. If you take my Bio 9 class, we talk about that a little bit. So that'll be polar body 1. And during this meiotic division, this will be polar body 2. And these are the cells that become reabsorbed and degenerate in the body. In addition to that, the ovaries make estrogen and progesterone. And so the granulosa cells surrounding the ovary, okay, the oocyte over here, these are going to be producing the estrogen. And the corpus luteum right here, both the early and the late, produce progesterone. So I think of the white areas as producing progesterone and red always making estrogen, well, pink being estrogen. So estrogen in itself does help support a pregnancy. It supports the developing embryo. But in addition to that, estrogen causes changes during secondary, or it causes changes in the development of secondary sexual characteristics of females and the maintenance of those characteristics. So, and I'm sorry this looks a little fuzzy, but the heart, the liver, bones, skin, the brain, breast, ovaries, and uterus all have a role to, or all respond to estrogen as it's being made by the ovaries. Progesterone itself stimulates other activities, especially activities of the uterine lining or epithelium. The lining of the uterus is an epithelium. Well, I know a lot of you probably have just talked about it as uterine lining. And it also helps estrogen in initiating or starting menses or a period. So the reproductive tracts or the reproductive tubes are accessory portions of the female reproductive system because they don't generate the ova, the gametes. So I wanted to show you a little bit more of an up close view of the ovarian ligament. So this is the ligament connecting the, it's medial in the body, but it's the lateral edge of the ovary to the wall of the uterus here. So there are two ligaments. The uterine tubes are about 10 centimeters long. They extend from the uterus out to the ovary. They are distal, and they're surrounded by those little fimbriae on the edge. This isn't the greatest picture showing fimbriae. The uterine fallopian tubes themselves have a nice mucus-lined surface that's slippery that allows the ova to travel down the fallopian tube. That mucus layer also helps protect the epithelium inside of the fallopian tubes. And if the ovaries have to be removed for whatever reason, that's called an ovariectomy or an ovarectomy. Ovarectomy, same thing. And that's where a doctor, let's say for some reason an ovary had been damaged or if it's diseased, the doctor will excise out the ovary and remove it. The uterus itself is made up of several sections. The body, the fundus, and the cervix. We'll talk about these in the next video, or at least we'll talk about them in more detail.